Tonight we are looking at chapter 10 in Romans, if you want to go there and look with me. And what I'll do tonight, there's been a handout given, so you can just jot notes as a nugget that means something to you tonight. I didn't give you a whole lot because we're just going to do some expository talking tonight or teaching on these verses. So we'll have a chance to read all these verses. So as you go along tonight and as we comment, I'm going to ask some questions as well. Just write these things down. But kind of where we are in the book of Romans, last week, chapter 9, started a 3-chapter thesis, I guess might be the right word. There's an English teacher in here. I think that might be the right word, a thesis about the sovereignty of God, the election of God, and how that applies to our hearts as Gentiles. But really, the thread going through the next 3 chapters, 9, 10 tonight, and 11 next week, Lord willing, we'll be finishing that next week. The thesis or the theme, the thread is Israel. How God's sovereignty, how his election affected them. Okay? There's a flow that goes with this book. And Paul will give a truth, and then from that truth, he realizes there's an inferred question or a question someone may have. It's very midrashic, I've been in Jewish services before, and the rabbi's talking, and a guy from the back would just go, and say something, and there's a dialogue. He asks a question. And so Paul, sensing that, he says a truth, and then a question is inferred or maybe even asked, and he answers that question. So before we got into chapter 9, there was a segue in chapter 8. In chapter 8, he says, I can't remember it all, I didn't write it down, but in chapter 8, you get to the part where he says, who he foreknew, he glorified, and justified, and who he justified, he glorified. And then he starts, and almost like a euphoric speech that starts coming out, what can separate us from the love of God? If God's on your side, if God's for you, who can be against you? And that's how we get to the end of chapter 8. Well, the natural question is, well, what about Israel? Are you not for Israel? Paul being a Jew. And so that's the question. That the punchline doesn't happen last week in chapter 9. We just start talking about it. The punchline's next week in chapter 11. So we're continuing on that saga tonight on that theory or that thesis about God's sovereignty and Israel. What happens in Israel? Pastor Dwayne pointed out the election of God, the hardening of the heart of God, on the heart of someone, or showing mercy to someone, and how that's a sovereign act of God. And he talked about, he starts out chapter 9 saying, brethren, my heart's desire for Israel, is that they be saved. I think that's what he says in chapter 10. But there is just this situation where he's wanting to talk about, well, what about Israel? Did God break his promise? Did God lose that battle? And so in chapter 9, we saw a few things that there is this sovereignty of God in the things that he does. It's his choice. God could have forced Israel to believe in Jesus. He could have worked with them so hard and broken them down so far to make them believe, but he didn't do that. Instead, what he did was what he did to Pharaoh, and that's the allegory we can see that this is an act of judgment. This isn't God just going, okay, I'm just not going to choose Israel. No, there's a response to something they did. When God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it was an act of judgment. Pharaoh was supposed to be a god. Pharaoh's, all these fake gods, and so everything he did through that was an act of judgment. And so this just kind of it's not an eternal judgment in the sense of that forever this is going to be on Israel, but as a response to them not being willing to hear, he hardened their heart but showed mercy to the Gentiles. And so that's kind of where we started last week, and this is where we leave off. We kind of got to the end of this, that God is bringing the Gentiles into the body, and for a season, he has blinded Israel. He's hardened Israel's heart in a sense of judgment. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. There's one thing I wanted to note that I had written down oftentimes when you look at God hardening Israel's heart, when you look at God showing mercy to the Gentiles, when you look at the statement in Romans chapter 8 where it says, who he foreknew, he justified, and who he justified, we glorified, those statements are meant for groups, not necessarily the individual within that group. And I think sometimes when we Christians want an explanation, sometimes in the scriptures, we look at things meant for groups and make them personal, and that's not what's going on, okay? Because if you look around, there are probably 1 million believing Jews today, okay? So tonight, let's continue on with this journey. What's God doing in Israel? Chapter 10, verse 1, and we'll start from there. It says, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. That they may be saved. When we get to chapter 11, there's going to be something that Paul says, and so I want to connect back again to the fact of who is he talking about? He's talking about Israel. But I want you to know Israel exists on several planes. Israel's a people. He's a person. It's a place. And then you've got this Israel of God, that's Jews and Gentiles in the new covenant. But when he's talking in chapter 9, 10, and 11, he calls them my race. He's not talking about the Israel of God, the spiritual Israel. And so hold on to that over the next 2 weeks, because we get what he's talking about is his brothers, the Jewish people who have not believed in their Messiah, the one whom he came for. If you go back to Isaiah 53, isn't that what he said? He came to his own, and his own received him not. So this is where Paul is, and it breaks his heart. It crushes him down to see that most of his brethren have not believed the message. When Jesus was in Nazareth and he read from Isaiah's scroll, and he said what he said, he said, a prophet is not received in his own home and among his own kinsmen. What they didn't realize is that he wasn't just talking about Nazareth, he was talking about the whole nation. Because for the most part, they rejected him. And so they're in this place, well, how can you be saved? Next, before we get to next week, between now and next Wednesday, I'm teaching next Wednesday, Lord willing, as I said, read Deuteronomy chapters 28 through the end of the book. And this will make a lot more sense. And I wanted to make sure I said that tonight. Deuteronomy's chapter 28 through the end of the book, and this will make more sense. And so Paul asking that question, has God failed? No, he said last week in chapter 9 that not everybody who is a child of Abraham through the flesh is necessarily of Abraham or of Israel. Just like, heartbreakingly enough, not every child who's raised in a Christian home becomes a Christian. Even more so for us on the Christian side of things. Not everyone who is born of the Jewish line cares for that or align themselves with that. There's a paradox that we live with as modern believers, and that's the paradox of God's sovereignty and our free will, and I can't explain it. I can't. I don't understand how it works. Sometimes when I pray, I'll just say, God, I don't know how this works. But you're sovereign, you've given us a free will, and somehow you still save people. That's a miracle. I wasn't great at all. I'd be the last guy I'd come after if I was looking for a dude to preach or to be a Christian or to be one of my kids, I'd be the last guy I'd adopt. How does it work? I don't know. He says it's mercy, and we thank God for that. But Paul is wanting Israel to be saved, so he prays to God for them. My heart and my prayer to God is, Lord, save your people, Israel, knowing what he said what he said in chapter 9 is that for a season God has hardened their hearts. Can I ask you a question? If God hardened your heart, how do you soften it? Someone said it? Only he can soften it. And I wanted to make that point. God is not divorced in this. He is not removed from the situation. This isn't God allowing them to harden his heart. No, that's not what Paul said. And one thing we must grasp is God is not to be trifled with. He really loves you. He loves me. He loves the world. But if he is willing, two things, to send his son to the cross for sin and to harden the heart of his original covenant people, who, by the way, are still his chosen people, because they don't want to listen. What that does for me, even though I live in grace and I wallow in grace, I don't want to trifle with him. I want to take him seriously and know that he is worthy to be trusted and believed. Look with me in verse 2. He says, "For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to the righteousness of God." They have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Ravi Zacharias, before he had his problem at the end of his life, made a statement one time about being on the wrong side of God, of thinking we're on the right side of God, but at the end of the day, being on the wrong side. I have experienced the zeal he's talking about. I've lived it. I've been fussed at on a Saturday as the sun was going down on a Saturday because we had lit a fire in a park. And they assumed, the people assumed that we had lit that fire before sundown. And thank goodness there was a guy with us who spoke Hebrew that said that's not what we did. It was sundown. It was the 3 stars in the sky. You know, we were getting fussed at for profaning the Shabbat. So I've lived that zeal. But it's a zeal that doesn't come with knowledge or understanding. One thing that I have done in my recent life in the last 5 or 6 years is ask God to forgive me for my idols. And I'm not talking about stuff. I'm talking the idols that I have presented as my understanding about who he is. Me misunderstanding him, who he is, and not seeing him as he really is. And looking at God that way, what are some ways that you might think that we can misunderstand God and in a way we fall short of who he really is? And that really is an idol. That's making a God in my heart. He tells us who he is. He describes himself. But can you think of some ways that we have idols, a wrong understanding of God? Does anybody want to be bold? Yes, sir. Okay. We question that character. There's one thing that's evident to me, and I think one of the idols we can have, or one of the ways we misunderstand God, is we think that he reasons like us. In Psalm 50, he's rebuking the people of Israel for some of the sins they're doing. And the punchline is this. He said, "You did this and I kept silent, and you thought I was altogether like you." And sometimes in my mind, I've thought that maybe God, he's reasoning like I reason, and that's an idol. That's not who he is. He don't reason like me. He's way up here, and we're. So sometimes we can have a zeal, but in a wrong way, without understanding. And I know this goes on the internet, and I don't want to come across as anti-Semitic. I'm not. But here's what happened. God shows up in the incarnation as the Son, and he says, "I'm going to show you who I am by how I live, and I'm going to live a righteous life, and I'm going to die for you, and you can take all my righteousness and believe in me." And Israel said, "That's okay, we'll take care of it." That's why he hardened their hearts. Anyone who gets saved, Jew or Gentile, must come through Messiah. The hardening, in a sense, is really in the whole faith system of Judaism itself. That's where the hardening is, because you're not going to find God in that. I'm sorry. Why? Because John in 1 John says, if you have not the Son, you have not the Father. And if you say that the Son is a heretic, and the Son is worthy of death, and the Son is not who he said he is, then guess who you don't have? The Father. That sounds very anti-Semitic, but that's not what I'm saying. But it would come across that way. You're on the wrong side of God. It doesn't have all the information. And that's the indictment here that Paul puts. There's a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Let's keep going. If I can find my spot. I'm going to take up in verse 4. And he says in verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law unto righteousness for everyone who believes. There's this grieving here that they've chosen the lesser. They've chosen themselves. But Christ is the end of the law for everyone who believes. He did it. He lived it. He fulfilled it. And the covenant that takes on from him is new. It's different. It's not just a list of rules. But once again, that was the choice. We're going to follow this. It's a big, zealous celebration of everything that is historical, everything that is what we were. And as I said, it sounds like I don't like Jews. That's not true. I love Jewish people. In fact, I love Israel. I'd live there if God would let me, but he's told me no. Verse 5, but Moses wrote about the righteousness which is based on the law, that the man who does these things shall live by them. How many of you remember Zola Levitt? Y'all remember Zola Levitt? Zola Levitt was a Jewish believer. He's a believer in Messiah. He got saved back in the 70s during the hippie movement. Most Jewish people who are Christian today or who believe in Messiah today, most got saved back there in the 70s in the hippie movement. No joke. Most of the ones that I know of. That's when the biggest revival since the early church, Jews came into the faith, was during the hippie movement. And Zola was one of those guys. Well, he had a program that used to come on. He went to heaven in 2005. But he lived in Dallas, Texas, but he would go over to Israel and he would film a series of shows. And I was watching one of the programs on a Friday night, and he made this point. He said that he was at the Western Wall, the Kotel, and he on purpose went to and stood outside the back where the women pray. The men pray on if you're standing from the front looking at the wall, they pray on the left side, and the women pray on the right side. They're separated. And he found a Orthodox woman praying, davening they call it, praying and reading her Siddur, her prayer book. And after it's finished, she was walking out, and Zola went up to her. He said, I asked you a question. She said, yes. He said, do you believe those prayers you're praying? And here's her answer. She said, I don't have to believe them. I just have to pray them. That is that pragmatism. I just do this. And that's what is pleasing to God. So you get this faith based on pragmatism. I do this, and God's pleased. The wonderful thing about us is our faith is based on a person. It's not based on always what we do. He affects what we do, right? He should. But Paul said, I know whom I believe, not what I believe. The key is the gospel. Not all the isms in the church. Not all the isms. The key is the gospel. I'm going to say something. I want you to hear me, and it's on tape. It's on, well, you can tell I'm aging myself, hadn't I? I said tape. And listen very carefully. You can be a Christian and go to hell. That's a religion. What have you done with the gospel? What have you done with Jesus? You know, there have been bishops in certain churches who deny the resurrection. They call themselves Christian. They call themselves a follower of Christ, but they've ignored the gospel. The gospel's the key. The faith we talk about Sunday after Sunday in our Sunday school, that pulls us together. We grow in that. But if you leave Jesus out, I don't care if you call yourself the Bishop of China. If Jesus isn't part of your faith, you've missed the boat. You're on the wrong side. It doesn't matter. I get irritated. I'm a video junkie, and I get irritated. And they'll say, well, how do we know this faith is fit this? And how do we know this is right? You've got to believe the gospel. That's what we have to believe is the gospel. What does Jesus say about himself? That's the key. So, yes, I hope people have a church, and yes, I hope people grow in faith, and yes, I hope they're part of the church, but I hope Jesus is the center of it. That gospel message is what we need, and that is not in Israel and the Jewish faith at this time. Verse 6 and 7 says, but the righteousness which is based on faith says, do not say in your heart who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who is to ascend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. He's actually quoting Deuteronomy chapter 30. That's why I asked you if you would read Deuteronomy 28 through the end of the book. You're going to find, I heard a preacher say this, that this was Jesus' favorite book to quote. I've never counted, but I'm going to take that preacher at his word. And I think that once again was Ravi Zacharias who made that statement, that the most quoted book when Jesus preached was Deuteronomy. But we see he's getting this from Moses. Listen, I cannot ascend to heaven. I cannot go into the grave. God's involved in this. He initiated this. He's the one who came up with the plan. He is the one who came up with the promise of the new covenant. He's the one who sent Jesus from heaven. He's the one who raised him out of the grave. And so he's got to be involved in it. And he's the one who makes the way. He's the one who touches our heart and shows us mercy and gives us that measure of faith in this. Yeah, you got to believe it. Once again, that sovereignty of God and your free will. I've been a Christian, I've been a believer since 1995, but every choice I have made and every act I have done has not been pleasing to God. On one side of the argument, they will say, if you follow the rabbit hole, it makes that God is really just making it all happen. Dwayne talked last week about the ism, the Calvinism, the idea. And if you follow that path, it really makes God an author of sin, but God doesn't do that. Even being his children, we can choose to disobey. We can choose to miss the mark. But he himself is the one that brought Jesus down from heaven, and he is the one who brought him up from the grave. Paul says in verse 8, says, but what does the word say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. Once again, Deuteronomy 30:14. So it's here within us. He gives it to us. It's been preached. It's been shared. It's been declared. And that's the word of faith for us right here in the heart. We know it in the heart. It begins before we do a single thing. It goes beyond just saying a prayer. It goes into the place of meaning your prayer. I want to ask you, does it comfort you to know that God sent the hounds of heaven after you? Do you find comfort in that? You might think of it, well, my mama took me to Sunday school, and my grandmother took me to church. But what you didn't see was the hounds of heaven nipping at those heels. God chasing you from heaven. It comforts me to know that he started the search. I didn't start it. That's comforting to me to know that God started this thing. I didn't start it. Okay. So this zeal that we have is very important, but it is better to have sincerity in the word and the will of God. Verse 9 says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That's the salvation through faith. If you believe in your mouth and confess with your heart that God raised him, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Once again, there is an exchange here. There is a cooperation with us and God. You know, he's not going to trip you and throw you down and body slam you. You know, I heard the story of a young kid. He was a Christian kid. He'd gone to school his whole life, and he was being bullied on the playground. And this kid just wouldn't leave him alone. And the little boy had a bait of it. And he took the bully and he slammed him on the ground. And he held him down with his arm behind his back like this and said, "Say Jesus is Lord. Say Jesus is Lord. Say Jesus is Lord." And the boy is actually a man's testimony. And the guy said at the end, the bully said, "Jesus is Lord." And he said, "I got up just enraptured with joy. I had my first convert." You know, he got him somebody to believe. Well, that's not how God does it, okay? We have to believe it. But look at the magic of it. And I'm going to use that word very judiciously. Look at this. You believe, you confess Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart he's alive. God raised him from the dead. Can I tell you, whether there was, and please, I'm trying to be what the Bible says. Even if you weren't bawling at the altar, the moment you really believed that, you were saved on the Word of God. The moment you really believe that, you were saved. It don't have to happen like it happened to me in 1980 when I was 11 years old, crying at the front of the church in the Free Will Baptist Church in Roper, North Carolina. It don't have to happen like that. The moment you really believe this message, you're saved. You're born into the kingdom of God. And that moment, you're as much his child as you will ever be. You might mature, you'll grow up, and you'll change. But just like the first moment Ethan Oliver took his first breath, or Jared Oliver, or Jonah Oliver, or Rachel Oliver, the moment they took their first breath, they were my child as much that day, that second, as they are now. They've grown. They have their own lives. But that's the wonder of your salvation. Before you did anything good, before you applied anything to your heart, before anything happened, God said, "You're just." Because of that, confess with my mouth, believe in my heart. That is the simplicity of the gospel. Do you understand? While after decades and centuries of such a hard way to approach, and all of a sudden this guy from Nazareth telling me I got to believe in him. Time goes by, he dies, he raises from the dead, and all these apostles, these Jewish guys telling the message, believe on Yeshua and you'll be saved. What do I got to do? Believe on Yeshua and you'll be saved. I'll stay with this. You see the temptation. But yet, that's the simplicity of the gospel. Verse 11 says, "For the scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be ashamed, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord over all is generous to all who call upon him." There's no different way for a Jew to be saved than a Gentile to be saved. Let's say it this way. There's no difference between a Jew to be saved or a Christian to be saved. You got to be saved through Jesus Christ. And if he's not Lord, I don't care what you call yourself, it really don't matter. You can be at the airport in a hair Christian robe. If you don't know Jesus, it does not matter. If you don't have the gospel, if you don't have Jesus, if you've got him, guess what he's going to do? He'll put you where he wants you. He'll lead you to the right place he wants you to be. But the key is putting him in the right place as Lord over your life. Yeshua Adon, the Lord. Verse 13, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Back in Romans 1:16, Pastor Mark taught that night. And he got to this verse, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, but also the Greek." Every Jewish person I know that's saved believes in Jesus Christ. And that's the only way. God, he's got one way he can save you. There's no other way but through Jesus. There just isn't. There's no other way, there's no other belief system apart from Jesus Christ. And we see this hardening of this lesson. I want you to think about that, church, real seriously tonight. Jesus died, I think, in the proper calendar, around 33 BC, AD. Paul writes this around the 60s AD. These are approximations. This is the year 2026. And that's still the position of most of Israel, that hardened heart. I've heard the sayings they say about Jesus, and it breaks your heart. I'm not, once again, this isn't the punchline, and God's not finished, so we're not finishing tonight, but we're still in that hardening place. So once again, God's not to be trifled with. We must respect him. We love him. We trust him. We believe in him, but he needs to be respected, because I've found out something about him, and you might not agree with me, but I've never known him to be in a hurry. And I say that reverently, but I've never known him to be in a hurry. I've been in a hurry most of my 57 years. And most of my calluses on my knees is me telling God to hurry up. I trust that he's going to get there. But man, I want him to get there sooner. Is that not all of us? We want him there yesterday. So we look at his patience, and we thank God tonight for Jesus Christ, that you and I don't have hardened hearts, that he showed us mercy, and we said yes. I have to say it that way. He didn't put me in a headlock and said, you better believe. He didn't do like the guy on the bully. Say Jesus is no, but thank God he touched me in a way that we could believe that message. Verse 14, now we're getting down to the end of it. How shall they call upon him whom they have not believed? And how they shall believe in him whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? We're getting into, once again, this place again about how this works. This isn't God just forcing people. What does he need? He does need human vessels. He needs preachers. He needs people speaking this message. He could send a whole myriad of angels to do it, but he's called us to do it. He's chosen to use human vessels. He's chosen to appoint apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers for the equipping of the church. And so, yes, there must be somebody declaring this message, but yet we go out with the message. God goes out with us. We are never, ever alone. That is just this. If you get nothing tonight, just go home and wonder that wonderful paradox of God's sovereignty and your free will. I don't understand how it works, but I'm thankful to him that it does. You don't have to understand everything. You don't have to have a neat, tidy answer for everything. That's what it means about childlike faith. Kid never asked me when my kids were little, Dad, how does that key, and when you do that thing in that engine, how does that work? Nobody ever said that. They just believed that Dad's driving, we're going to get to see Nana and Papa. Just that childlike faith. I am so glad that it works. Verse 15, and how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel, who bring good news, or bring the news of good things. That's Isaiah 52:7 and Nahum 1:15. God dispatches his messengers with this sovereign call, share the news, Jesus is Lord. In verse 16, but they have not all believed the gospel, for Isaiah says in Isaiah 53, Lord, who has believed our report? So that goes back to that chapter in the Bible that is taboo in Israel, Isaiah 53. This statement of faith of who Yeshua, who Jesus is. There is no salvation apart from him. Verse 17, so then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Once again, Paul is taking us on this journey to explain this situation of the hardening of the heart of Israel and the sovereignty of God. God does not break his promises, but God does keep his word, and he has kept the word that he said would happen to a hardened heart. What would happen if we don't believe? But when we hear the word of God, when we hear the message preached, that's how faith comes. The word of God. Not my word, but his word. Verse 18, but I say, have they heard? And he's talking about his brothers. Their voice went out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. It went out to every place that they were living at the time. Verse 19 through 21, this will be the end of it. But I say, did Israel not know? First, Moses said, I will make you jealous by those who are not a nation, and by a foolish nation I will anger you. That's Deuteronomy 32:21. One of the things we're going to learn is that one of the reasons God did what he did among the Gentiles, one, he said he would, but there's also a motivation behind it, was to make the Jewish people jealous. Once again, on a Zola Levitt program back in the late 90s, there was a pastor. He was a Jewish guy, once again saved in the hippie movement. And he was a pastor at a church. You might have heard it because they have music out. King of Kings. There was a fellowship in Jerusalem called the King of Kings. And they used to put out like Hillsong, like whatever other churches are putting out music. King of Kings would put out their own worship music. And they had some really good ones out of a Hebrew flavor. But anyway, one of the pastors was a Jewish guy. And Zola asked him, well, how did you come to faith? And he tells the story. He said, I was driven to jealousy by a Gentile friend. What the Bible said. And part of this is the group mentality here, not just all individuals. Man, if somebody watches, they're going to think, that guy's an anti-Semite. I am not. But how many of you have close Jewish friends nearby? No. Kind of hard to make somebody jealous you don't know, isn't it? But how, as a church, how can we, Gentile people, live so close to God that a rabbi sees us and goes, how? How do you have that peace? How do you know that? Can we live that close to him? Can the church, and one thing that breaks my heart is at times the disjointedness in the modern church. Just how sometimes, maybe not in here, maybe not in Clinton, North Carolina, but oftentimes there's bickering, who's right, who's wrong. There's videos about, are they really saved? Can I tell you something? None of us in here tonight are omniscient. But what we can be is loving, genuine. You see a brother stumble, you pick him up, don't put him down, don't push him further. Show some love and compassion. I remember in my early days with the Lord, I was a bumbling idiot. I was very overzealous, didn't know nothing, thought I knew it all. But if we can love and live so close like Jesus would live, that's how you drive the Jewish people to jealousy. There's a relationship there. There's an intimacy with God because of what Jesus did. Verse 20, and Isaiah is very bold and says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. Isaiah 65:1. And that's what he did. The whole message. We take it for granted. If I show a hand, how many of you in your life, now you don't have to raise your hand, but I want you to think about it. How many of you went to Sunday school at the church that most likely your mama went to? Now, my mama grew up in Illinois, so that didn't happen for me. There's that heritage. But think back 2,000 years to whoever your ancestors are. And guess what? They probably weren't thinking about Jehovah God. They weren't asking for him. But one day, out of nowhere in the Greek world and the Roman world, the first Christian country is Armenia. But one day they were pagans, and all of a sudden these guys show up. I think they think Bartholomew, as church history, went to Armenia. And this guy says, hey, have y'all heard about this guy named Jesus? No, tell us about him. Is he a God? He said, oh, he's more than that. And all of a sudden, their hearts are opened up to the truth. And no longer are they worshiping idols. They're worshiping the one true God. And 10 days before, they were bowing down at an altar. But Israel, who are davening in the temples and in the synagogues and proclaiming righteousness, God says, you've hardened your heart. You don't want to do it my way. Let me help you. And that's what he did. Because he was ready for them to receive. We're going to see how all this works out next week. Now, next week's a way better, more exciting. This is probably that might be one of my favorite chapters in all the Bible is Romans chapter 11. So come out next week and read as I asked you to, if you remember, Deuteronomy 28 through the end of the book. And then verse 21, he says, but to Israel, he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. Isaiah 65:2. Don't think that this wasn't some pain on the heart of God. I believe that. Now, like I say, he's not like me, but I try to put myself in his position, and I even do that sometimes kind of trembling here. But I've got 4 kids, and I love them more than I love my own life. And they've never disappointed me to the point that I'm saying, okay, everything that was yours, I'm giving to your best friend, Johnny Joe. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine that. What does that do to the heart of God? I don't know. But because let me tell you, as much as you love your babies, he loves you way more and way better. So what does that do to him? I don't know. But I know next week we got some good news coming. We're going to see how this ends up. We're going to read the punchline, what happened. But just to back up, here's what's going on. God sent his son into the world to save the Jewish people first, and they said, we'll handle it. We like our way better. And God said, okay, I'm going to make sure you do that. He said, I've got other people, and that's us. Now, he didn't forget the other Jews, the first early church. Most of them were Jewish. But as we saw in chapter 9 last week, just a few. The next week, we get to see the good news and the great news of how God's going to work this all out. And I will tell you today, it's a big deal. So come out next week, read these verses. Does anybody have a question or a comment that you would like to bring to us this evening before we dismiss? Something in your heart, something on your heart, something about this tonight that I didn't cover. Maybe it's on your heart burning. Somebody got something you'd like to add or a question you got? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes, sir. Okay, that wall that they're praying at is considered a synagogue. That wall is the old retaining wall of the old temple. And the reason they go to that wall is they believe that that is the closest place to the old Holy of Holies, where the priest would go in once a year, and where the Ark of the Covenant is. They believe it's in that. And so to them, the presence of God is still there. So that's as close as they're going to get. So that's why they put prayers in there. Okay. So that's why they do that. But what do you and I have that they don't have? Where is he living? Right here, in us. We don't need the Ark of the Covenant. He's in us. Wow. We don't deserve it, but that's the truth. Thank you for that question. Somebody else? Aaron's rod that budded, the manna from the wilderness, and the tablets. And then the Pharisees put the hemorrhoids in there, and the mice. Y'all know that's what happened when the Pharisees got the Ark of the Covenant. God struck them with it, and so they put some hemorrhoids in there. How did they know what they looked like anyway? But that's what was going on with that. So I think those might have been taken out. I don't know. But those were the original 3 things that I remembered. Is something else that I forget? The tablets, the Aaron's rod that budded, and the manna from the wilderness, manna. What is it? The word for what in Hebrew is manna. What is it? Anybody else? So next week's going to be a party. That's some good news. It's some exciting news. So read ahead, Deuteronomy. Thank y'all for listening. We just stand before we pray.